Welcome everybody to the latest SPF UK Climate Resilience Programme webinar. May we have the next slide, please? Today we'll be talking about climate services. This is a topic that's central to the programme. We've had a number of speakers previously showing demonstrations of climate services. Today we've got a slightly different format, so we'll be hearing from Louise Wilson and Nicola Golding, really thinking about the need and the potential format of a UK national framework for climate services. We've then got a panel discussion. We've got four excellent speakers for the panelists. They'll be introduced later in more detail. And Chris Hewitt will be chairing the panel discussion today. So very much encourage you to participate and put in your questions. Next slide, please. As usual, we'll start with the presentation, then the panel, and at the end we'll have a brief summary of what's coming next over the next two seminars. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. You'll be able to see that at the bottom of your Zoom window, and also look to see what other people are posting. Upvote those questions that you really want to see a focus on, those questions that you might want to ask yourself. Attendees will remain muted unless enabled to speak by the host, and the webinar, both the audio and the slides, will be shared after the event, so it's possible to both revisit it and forward it on to colleagues. If you have technical problems, put those into the chat. We'll try and help out. And just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded. We would encourage you as well, if you want to tweet, that you'll see at the bottom of the screen the details, and also the website details are at the bottom of the screen. In terms of news from the programme, one of the successful aspects of the programme is the idea of embedding researchers with organisations that are using climate information. Organisations have been putting forward their ideas to use embedded researchers, and we've now got a call open for people to apply to the embedded researcher scheme. Deadline 22nd of July, and there are now a minimum of 5 places rather than the 3. There's a link at the bottom to the web address. Very much encourage you to have a look at that, and also see what some of the existing embedded researchers have been doing. Next slide, please. We'd also like to draw your attention to an event coming up later this week on the 15th at 9:30, focusing on climate change adaptation and the power sector. There are a number of speakers from DEFRA, Committee on Climate Change, Cabinet Office, etc. And they'll be debating some of the issues around a resilient energy system as we head towards COP26. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Louise and Nicola and hear about the national framework. Louise.
Thank you, Jason. Sorry about that, everybody. Nicola, please.
Thanks, Louise, and thanks, Jason, for the introduction. I'm going to jump straight in because we've got a lot to get through this webinar. Just to briefly introduce this project, it arose out of the sense of a need for something else in terms of national coordination for climate services in the UK, and the acknowledgement that while we have a lot that is really good in the UK, there is space and missing pieces that could really enhance the climate services landscape. So what we've done so far, and what we hope to do over the remainder of the project, is to explore with the climate services community in the UK what is missing, and whether a national framework for climate services of some sort would benefit the UK climate services community, and what that would look like. So next slide, please, Louise. So we've undertaken a series of activities so far this year, including looking at what's happened in other parts of the world, which will be represented by some of our excellent speakers this morning. We've had some really focused bilateral conversations with key players in climate services in the UK, particularly UK government. We've had various opportunities for people to input and learn about what we're doing. And what we're going to focus on today is the workshops that we've held over the last month, 6 workshops in total, engaging with as broad a group as possible to try and understand what it is that the community wants, needs, or feels that we would benefit from. And then a couple of other events, such as the forum recently and the webinar today. So we'll jump on to the next slide, please. So these workshops that we've held were designed to take a stock take of current capability and really identify what the current gaps are and what people think could fill those gaps or could be good solutions, which might be supported by a national framework for climate services. And as you can see from the figures there on the slide, we think we've really managed to reach a wide group of participants. I think everyone, we hope, was represented by someone given the opportunity to participate. A few people weren't able to join the workshops, but were given opportunities to have a one-to-one discussion afterwards to make sure that we captured those views across a wide range of sectors across the whole of the UK. And we got a really good gender split as well. So yeah, we asked a couple of questions: how well are things working currently, and were there key gaps that people felt national level coordination could help bridge, and where should future effort be directed? Next slide, please. Just to quickly fill you in on how we did this, it was a series of 2-hour workshops. We ran identical workshops 6 times. They were held on different days of the week to try and give people opportunities to attend at different times of day. We didn't record the workshops because we wanted people to feel really comfortable in expressing blunt and honest views, which is definitely what we got. But we managed to capture as much of the information as possible by using these interactive Jamboards, which you can see examples of on the slide. And we've just got so much information from this. I think we were both really pleased. All the people who helped run the workshops were really pleased with the input that we got, how open people were, and we're currently wading through all of the input. But Louise is going to share with us some of the top or more surprising discussions that were held and some of the key things that came out of these workshops.
Thanks, Nicola. So what did people say during these workshops? We've selected just a tiny handful of the enormous amount of input that we have to show you here. So these are real quotes from real people, from yourselves, saying, you know, things that they thought that a national framework or that a sort of higher level national coordination could assist with in the UK. And I think that the example that we've got here really demonstrates the very broad scope and wide-ranging number of themes that people wanted to talk about and were concerned about. So, for example, you know, it was felt that a national framework could really help with that linking between impacts and adaptation communities at local and regional levels. So not just having a national approach, but really pulling that through into adaptation and action on the ground. It was also felt that, you know, a national framework could support the development of national scenarios, which would assist disclosure and regulation within and across industries and sectors. And this was really supported by, you know, a variety of comments that from the user perspective about how to put climate risk on an appropriately weighted playing field with other risks, common definitions for how to measure resilience, and really, you know, frameworks really and standards and guidance for balancing the confusion that users said they sometimes experienced when going to academia for assistance, where perhaps they're getting a little bit too much information for their needs, versus, you know, a limited picture, which is sometimes given from consultants and which isn't quite adequate to meet their needs. Other themes that arose during the workshop were themes around, you know, knowledge exchange, so the need for collaborative forums between industries, the development of improved data and knowledge portals, and concepts of who pays. So if you have data portals and knowledge portals that perhaps are linking climate risk to hazard and impact, you know, who needs to pay for this work, and how should it be made accessible? And finally, another really important theme, and I'll elaborate on all of these in the next 2 slides, was this awareness and a view of what work is coming up, what's on the horizon to enable the climate services community to adequately plan. So, as Nicola said, we have an enormous amount of information to now go through and synthesize. So what I wanted to share with you today was really some of the interim findings. And I've grouped these in a couple of different themes or pillars. And I won't go through all of the information on these slides. You can, of course, refer to them in your own time. But we felt that one of the key pillars was really around awareness. So a desire from the current climate services community to have an understanding of what is happening right now, and linking that to what is being planned for, so that good ideas do not wither on the vine. And this concept of a who's who and a what's what. So it was felt that a national level coordination should be able to connect groups and people together with appropriate experts, and that currently this is really difficult to do in the UK. On the theme of knowledge exchange, there was a strong desire for that to be performed regionally. The regional forums from UK CIP were mentioned on more than one occasion as an exemplar of something that worked really well. And also this idea of creating an environment where we not just exchange good news stories about services that have worked really well, or about the latest co-development or co-production that we have done, but also an environment where we're able to exchange learning and knowledge about where it hasn't worked so well, so being able to share failures. There was a strong theme around the need for standards and for the production and dissemination of guidance material. And this is really complementary to other UK climate resilience projects. So some of you may have been or are involved in the JBA-led project developing standards for climate services. And this was really underpinned by a desire for common language and common understanding, really to get everybody on the same page, to be able to begin to effectively share information. And there was some interesting discussion during the workshops on, if you have standards, does there need to be regulation, and who might that need to involve? There was plenty of discussion around different ethical concerns as well. So this was not just around equitable access to information, but also around ensuring that everybody who is impacted by climate risk has the opportunity, or that there is a process for ensuring that those voices are part of the response, to changing climate risk. There was a strong emphasis on the need for a public good focus here, and we had some interesting discussion around the tension between the need for public good, and the desire for a very vigorous market. And this ethical concerns also goes to this idea of creating fora for people to be able to share not just success stories, but failures. So how do we protect people when they're speaking within a forum and sharing information? And finally, there were some discussion around the need for roles and responsibilities to be well defined or clearly defined. Are clearer boundaries needed and desirable? who has responsibility and who should be paying for different services. The second part of the workshop, as Nicola mentioned, was really focused more on solutions and what to do next. And I just wanted to put a few dot points there to demonstrate to you the huge variety of innovative ideas that were shared with us. It was just really great to hear all the different ideas that people had for improving, climate service delivery across the UK. So beyond the usual sort of ideas of sharing case studies and creating forums, there was also suggestions for developing user journeys or user archetypes that could be shared perhaps via videos or via focused fora where people can share questions and building a community of practice, and also ideas around storyboards and even involving the role of and involving the popular press. So I'll hand back to Nicola now to talk about the next steps.
Unmute myself. Thanks, Louise. So as we've described, there was a huge amount of information came out of these workshops, and such a variety of views that we're keen to make use of and not lose in amongst the noise. So we're currently undergoing a period of synthesis, trying to draw together the different strands and group really the results that we got, and we'll be identifying potentially some easy wins that we might be able to act on more immediately. But our main aim is to provide recommendations for what a framework could achieve and what it would look like, and with that would be a roadmap for how to get there. Now, all of the people who took part in the workshops were given the option to stay engaged in a variety of ways. So we have an ongoing user group really for this work, but there is the option for people to input their views still, and we'll have a little voting opportunity later in this session for you to do so if you want to, and we'll also be sharing the paper when it's completed to get some feedback. But we're really hoping that the activities undertaken and the breadth of the engagement that we've done will mean that that views across the climate services community will be well represented. So I think that's us. You can contact us if you like, but on to Jason or Louise, are you introducing the speakers? Or Chris, maybe.
Actually, Chris is introducing the speakers, so Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Jason. Hi, everyone. It's Chris Hewitt here. I am having technical difficulties, so I'm afraid I can't run my camera. I head up the International Climate Services team at the Met Office, so it's great that we have these four international perspectives. Thank you to all four of the speakers for agreeing to join, especially Karl. I'm not sure what time of day it is for you. So without further ado, so the first one is Karl Braganza, the National Climate Services Manager at the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. So I've had the pleasure of working quite a lot with the Australian Bureau of Meteorology over the last 10 years or so on climate services. So I'm looking forward to this. Karl has been instrumental in establishing the new Australian Climate Service, which I believe he will speak about today. Karl, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chris, and hi to everyone. I'm going to whiz through these slides. So I'm talking about the Australian Climate Service, and there has been a lot of thinking over the last 10 years around frameworks for climate services in Australia. But I just want to highlight that real world events have been a significant motivator for what is a coordinated government response in Australia. So these are some recent fire events. These are really big fire events. So the bottom two figures here, you're looking at fire activity over around a 600-kilometre stretch of the landscape. And these have had huge consequence and huge impact across all sort of government jurisdictions in Australia, which has informed what is the arrangements that I'm about to describe. Go to the next slide. So the Commonwealth, or the federal government in Australia, has formed 3 new agencies, or it's enhanced an existing agency in Emergency Management Australia, which is similar to FEMA in the US. It's established a National Resilience and Recovery Agency. So this is collecting together a bunch of recovery agencies that have existed and been set up after recent natural disasters, and this is a permanent sitting body. And then there is the Australian Climate Service, which is basically there to serve these two agencies. So the reach down to the other jurisdictions, so the state governments and local government in Australia, and community will be done through NRA and N2RA for resilience and through EMA for emergency management. And next slide, please. So there's 4 entities that make up the Australian Climate Service. They're all Commonwealth agencies. So one is the Bureau of Meteorology, the other is CSIRO, who conduct not just a lot of weather and climate research in Australia, but also research on intervention and adaptation. The Australian Bureau of Statistics brings to the table socioeconomic data, vulnerability data at a national scale, and then Geoscience Australia has asset and location data, again, looking at hazard exposure and vulnerability. That data is going to be integrated in the Australian Climate Service, as well as a bunch of other services. And again, just emphasising feeding those 2 agencies sitting above us. Next slide, please. So the service basically has a number of elements. One is gathering exposure, vulnerability and decision-making data across Australia, which is probably one of the harder tasks. It's got governance arrangements that it needs to intersect with, and it needs to pull together data, as you can imagine, in various different formats and states of readiness for use. Seamless weather and climate data and seamless risk data is a major component of this service. So we want to take the production of particularly hazard projection data in Australia out of pilot projects and small funded projects into something that's basically operationalised and sits alongside weather forecasting and seasonal forecasting in Australia. There's a knowledge brokering capability here. So looking at how users will make decisions, how that will inform the service itself. And a big part of this is consulting services. So we know we can't serve everyone. That's why there's a bit of a target here on these 2 agencies in the Commonwealth. There is a plan to expand this out over the next 4 years to reach more users. But basically that is in recognition that we can't just throw data at the users. There has to be a very well-defined analytical data integration and consulting service that comes along with that. And as touched on by Louise and Nicola, nationally standardised methods are really important here. So not only to work with current regulators across different sectors, but also to standardise the approach towards the risk analysis itself. Going to the next slide. So when we talk seamless earlier, what we're really talking about is trying to create consistent approaches to risk across the different planning horizons. So we can talk about operational, tactical and strategic planning horizons. The aim here is to, whatever intervention we do, if it's at the strategic planning horizon, we want to actually improve the operational environment and the tactical environment as well. And that's in recognition that we are living in a changing system. So our options for tactical options, for example, will run out if we don't have the right strategic options in place. And then we won't have enough operational levers to pull when these events come along. Can I go to the next slide, please? And this is just broadly looking at how that service sits alongside current operational services. So down the bottom, GA in Australia, Geoscience Australia have responsibility for geological hazards. Tsunami, the Joint Tsunami Warning Centre sits between the Bureau and GA, and obviously the weather modelling and seasonal forecast sits within the Bureau. Some of that information will go up into the Australian Climate Service as well as the modelling capability and join with data from other domains. So again, looking at that data integration, there's some elements there that we really want to hit, and they're quite similar to those that have been discussed earlier in this meeting. And then on the right, we want to reach Commonwealth customers. So we're using that framework of where we are a provider to a customer here, and we have a customer committee across the Commonwealth that will look at what we're doing and adjust it as we go along. And then next slide. And this is just an example of one of the data integration exercises we went through with some of the workshops that we ran, pulling together data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, socioeconomic, built environment, so building stock vulnerability, and then looking at the physical hazard risk itself. So this is the sort of work that we imagine we'd be doing in that kind of analytical mode. And then as the service matures, we are looking to build the capability in some of our next users as well. And that's me done.
Thank you very much, Karl. That's excellent. Because of my technical difficulties, I missed what Jason said right at the beginning, but I think the plan is still to go through all of these presentations, all 4 of them, and then we'll take questions and answers afterwards. So thank you very much for the first one. So Julia has already put a question in the box, so please do put questions in the box as we go along. So without further ado, on to the second speaker, Keith Lambkin, Senior Climatologist and Climate Services Research and Applications Division at the Irish Meteorological Service. So I've had the pleasure of working with Keith quite a lot in recent times, and it's fantastic that Keith can join us here today. And then I'm joining a similar webinar tomorrow, or workshop tomorrow, with Keith in Ireland. So METEORN is partnering with others in Ireland on a project to standardise national climate projections, and Keith will be telling us a bit about the work in Ireland. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks, Chris, very much for the introduction, and good day, everybody. We can jump straight into the next slide there, Louise. Thanks very much. So a rather familiar story in Ireland. So we have legislation that required our sectors to produce climate adaptation plans, which they all successfully did on time by late 2019. But we found during the process that it was a bit more difficult to get their hands on some of the climate information that they needed than it possibly could have been. In addition to this, then, as well as our sectors, all of our local authorities, who were not required under the legislation to do so, but were proactive anyway, and also created their own individual climate adaptation plans at exactly the same time. And this created an unprecedented demand for climate information in Ireland. Add to this then the existing ad hoc climate service projects that were continually happening anyway. And while all these projects were fit for purpose for the reasons that they were funded, they were perhaps not as transferable to other sectors than they possibly could have been. So to try and address some of these issues, and you can click on there, Louise, please, introduced METEORN's Translate project. And what this was we consulted the major climate service provider stakeholders in Ireland, and we produced a memo for the Irish government. So by the time that memo came out of government, it essentially gave us the mandate to tackle 2 tasks within this project. One was to standardize our national climate projections. At present, we don't have a standardized baseline set of projections. There are many, unlike the standards of the UK CP18, for example. So one is to solve that. It should help streamline things. And the second thing then is to develop climate services based on this new standardized national baseline projection data set. And you can think of this largely as a proof of concept to show the advantages of a standardized national climate service production system. Now, partly by design, and in truth, partly by luck, some of the major academic players, the logos at the top of the screen there, they all came together and won the contract. And the players who aren't actually involved in doing the work then, we managed to get on board as part of the steering committee. So we now have all the major players for climate service delivery within Ireland, all now working on the same 2-year project, the Translate project. 2 years intentionally short because we want the outputs from the Translate project to be available for the next iteration of our national adaptation plans. A lot of work for 2 years project, I know, but it's more than a project. Really what we're doing here is we're trying to plant a seed. And if you click on, Louise, please, that seed is for something larger, a national framework for climate services for Ireland. Because projects are great, but all projects finish. What we need is an operational infrastructure in order to house the outputs of Translate, while at the same time continuing the operation, production and development of climate services in Ireland. Now, largely what we've been looking at guidance through the Global Framework for Climate Services. And in the diagram there, in a simplistic form, what it's doing is it's looking at the different sectors, which are the orange boxes down towards the bottom. And we're already dealing with a lot of those sectors anyway, because they all put together climate teams in place at the time of developing the climate adaptation plans. At the top there in red then, this framework would have a steering committee made up of senior representatives from those major climate service stakeholder organizations. Now, this is important, one, to bring what the framework is doing back to host organizations. But two, equally important, it's important that the business plans within these organizations then also feed back into the National Framework for Climate Services. And then the idea in that middle layer, which is really the engine which drives a lot of the work, that's where we'll hopefully have permanent representatives who will work in developing climate services to a standardized fashion, but as well as that, also integrate internationally with the likes of the powerhouses that are Copernicus, the outputs from the ERA 4 CS projects, the Primavera, outputs from Climate Europe, and the many others, while also obviously engaging with the existing climate initiatives that are already in place within Ireland. Initiatives like our climate adaptation portal, Climate Ireland, our climate research coordination group, and also our National Adaptation Steering Committee, as well as many others. See, what we have found is that while a lot of the ad hoc climate service projects that have happened in Ireland to date have been fit for purpose and were fairly good at meeting the needs that they were designed for, we feel that more of an operational, standardized national framework is required to more effectively meet the increased demand and surge in climate services that we expect to see into the future. I think I'm out of time with that, Louise, so I'll pass it back to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith. That's excellent. It's fascinating to hear these two. They are different examples, but there are some commonalities, and you're from what I can tell, you're at slightly different parts of the journey. But that's fantastic. Thank you. On to the next speaker. So Roger Street, Associate Fellow of Green Templeton College and Honorary Research Associate at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. I've known Roger for a long time now. We've been working very closely together on climate service activities. So yes, Roger is based in the UK. You hear from his accent, he's not British, but he's very, very active internationally, especially in Europe. So I think his international perspective will be great here. He has a wealth of experience in knowledge exchange platforms and how they can enable climate action. And he'll be speaking briefly about some of his experiences. Roger, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris. What I thought I'd do is talk to you about what are the things that some of the things that came out of our European Climate Change Adaptation Conference webinar that was on climate knowledge and information as enablers for climate action. And these are some of the relevant messages that came out. Next slide, please. Now, this at your service, this webinar that we held was really to explore our current the current status and means of enhancing how we were not only use but also develop knowledge and information. And it was looked at in the context of these are enablers of climate action. And the things we wanted to do is really understand how, what are some of the successes that are occurring in this area, and what are areas that needed priority action in order to make them these enablers so that they better informed and inspired the action that was needed to address not only today's challenges, but the future challenges as well. And then also focusing on the connections and collaborations that could facilitate addressing these challenges and opportunities. And so the whole idea was to try and focus on what are some of the solutions to providing knowledge and information that could enable these actions. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that we started out is that this is just a quick overview, and this doesn't include everything. But this is the current status. Where are we? What are we finding? What's happening? And a number of people expressed the concern that what we currently have is primarily developed based on siloed perspectives, climate hazards. And they've been based primarily on climate science and a varied understanding of users' needs. Every project, I don't know how many projects have been undertaken and how many studies have been undertaken to try and understand users' needs, but there are a variety of needs that are being expressed. But there's also that what is available is failing to create the trust and create an appetite for this knowledge and information. And these are some of the barriers that are out there that were identified. You know, the lack of what is available is not easy to use. It's not always produced to a high enough or agreed standard. And this is leading to misuse and unintended consequences. You know, we're really looking at a huge gap, what is actually required and what is or can be provided. And this links to the concern that the user focus is really in its infancy. And this then led people to conclude that what some people call COEX in various disciplines, co-design, co-production, co-evaluation, they are recognized. They are recognized as things that we should be doing, but we don't really understand and embrace or deliver what is needed in practice. And so this gets back to this user focus being in its infancy as well. Next slide, please. Now, some of the other messages sort of where we need to be looking at, and these are things I thought that might be interested from informing a UK framework for climate services. And democratizing climate knowledge and information is really an important and becoming more and more important in terms of how we look at providing the information that's really needed, bringing that knowledge to those that need the information, but also bringing it, and democratizing its availability. And this was linked to, and you could link this to the idea that we had to start working with national or regional knowledge and information platforms, as these are already recognized in an effective way of enhancing the impact and knowledge, the impacts of this information, knowledge and information, and also ways of sharing it. There is really a need for a focused effort, an enhanced focused effort on translating climate knowledge and information so that what is provided is closer to the skills and requirements of the target audience, target users, target clients. If we look at it from the concept of, is it relevant? Is it usable? Is it legitimate? And is it credible? So you need to translate it to to get it so that it can be used. And often that is not well done. We've learned a lot. There's a lot that has been learned about how we interact with the intended users. And this is all on that COEX again. But there is a real need to upscale what has been learned in various projects and activities, and to bring that, the knowledge and lessons learned, and bring it out and bring it into the community so we get a much better understanding of what really is involved and what needs to be involved at COEX. It needs to be appropriate. It needs to be, an agreed way forward. And I think we really need to better understand this. Next slide, please. Now, when we came down to looking at how this was going to be used and what it meant for using implementation of adaptation and resilience strategies and plans, there's a real need to start reimagining what are climate services. What is the knowledge and information that is needed? We have to reimagine this, because what we are currently doing, many believe is not fit for purpose. So what we really need to do is support making adaptation and resilience smarter and systemic, and enable the implementation in a timely fashion. Providing information on impacts is really interesting, and it gets you partway there, but it doesn't get you to where you want to go. If you want to support adaptation and resilience, you have to go beyond that, go beyond thinking about the development and use of that knowledge and information so it better reflects society and political priorities. And this is really moving towards a Paris Agreement lifestyle and well-being. But it's also linked to the fact that there are seldom any decisions taken solely to address climate impacts. It's more about that needed to inform the complexity of decisions that are out there. And when you think about that, what this leads to is this reimagining climate service. We have to think about it as integrating that knowledge and information with knowledge, data, and information from non-climatic sources. And we really need to think about how that, and that means we need to reimagine the climate services if it is really to support decision-making and solutions. Next slide, please. Connections, collaboration. We have to, these are essential to effective knowledge sharing and building the trust and capacity. We need to bring the user communities and climate services communities closer together, collaborating to ensure that what we're developing is the right knowledge and tools and dissemination platforms that are, and I use the word right there, and I should have put it in quotes, because it really needs to focus on right for the particular intended user. We need to enhance that support by investments in knowledge and information translation, so that you can, those connections and collaborations can be much more user-friendly and much more relevant. We need to, there's a strong need to establish and support existing and new partnerships. The sooner we recognize that climate services are being produced by both the private and public sector, and formally recognize that and formally integrate the private and public sector into the provision of knowledge and information, the better it will be for climate services, really sharing knowledge, experience, and collaboration to address the challenges. What we found when I was doing some work in Australia is that the private sector is investing, not as maybe as much as the public sector, but they are investing in research, they are investing in innovation. And we need to be able to bring that in as part of what we're looking at. And a framework needs to bring in the private sector as well as the public sector. And then improving roles along that value chain, or what I like to call the value web, is really an essential to address concerns about equity and inclusion and enhancing that the democratization of the data and knowledge. Next slide, please. We need to consider user decision-making journeys. How are these being used? Not just how did they do a particular case study, but how are they used over time? People sharing that type of information is better for understanding the climate services that are needed, but also understanding it's better understanding of how they could be used. We need to really target understanding solution rather than just understanding impacts and risks. This is really talking about that is consistent, that which is consistent with that needed to support the decision-making processes and implementing actions. Climate services do not stop at the development or the undertaking of a risk assessment. It needs to look at the implementation risk assessment. It needs to look at the monitoring and evaluation, and it needs to go beyond that and really try to understand the full cycle of where that information has value. We need to, and that gets to supporting that iterative decision-making process. We are not going to make decisions and say, decision made, done, don't need to do that one anymore, because there's continuous learning and improvement that needs to take place, not only because of the new data and information that's out there, but because of our better understanding of the risks and our better understanding of the solutions. So we need to support that transitional actions that are going to move us towards the transformational adaptation that is now upon us, and even more will be upon us in the near future. So we need to reimagine climate service to support transformational adaptation. We need to build that trust, as I've talked about in a number of situations, a number of other, should say, forums, and it's really develop QA, QC, and agreed standards and ethics so that we can build that trust. And I believe strongly that we need to have a periodic and regular assessment of the knowledge and information that are out there and what is needed. We need to be in advance of the user's requirements and capabilities as they're being developed. So we need this periodic and regular assessment so that we can support the actions that are needed. Next slide, please. This is an image of the results of the At Your Service webinar. And I'm pleased that these slides are going to be available because I'll leave them to you to look at these in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. Excellent perspectives. And so on to our final speaker, Christopher Jack, Deputy Director of the Climate Systems Analysis Group in the University of Cape Town. So I've not worked so closely with Christopher Jack. I've worked with the team there, but I'm really very much looking forward to hearing the Africa context there. So Chris has an interest in the intersection of climate services and ethics and telling us about activities in Africa. Chris, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity. Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating so far hearing all these different perspectives. And I think what's really interesting is the common themes that are coming out from these different perspectives. And I think I'm going to touch on a number of those common themes today. So there's so much I could talk about around climate services in Africa, but I'm going to home in particularly on the sort of climate services landscape, and particularly some of the work we've been doing recently in South Africa around managing this landscape, some of the tensions in this landscape, and so on. So I'm presenting this as an African perspective. I have no authority to represent Africa at all. I may have some marginal authority to talk about South Africa. But the reason I'm framing it as an African perspective is I think that many of the issues I want to talk about are fairly common across a number of African countries and a number of developing world, if you want to use those kind of labels, countries. And I think these are perspectives that we need to take seriously internationally. And I'm going to particularly pick up on the sort of international perspective. So a lot of this thinking came out of a process that we coordinated here in South Africa over the past year. It was a series of dialogues focused on questions of ethics in climate services. So we coordinated these dialogues amongst a number of stakeholders within South Africa. So it was very much focused on South Africa. So national stakeholders, government stakeholders, some private sector stakeholders, and a number of climate science or science stakeholders across the different spectrum, university and other science institutions. So it was quite a broad representation. And the dialogues focused on a number of different issues, ranging from the production of climate services and the production of climate information, all the way through to aspects of, from the user perspective, how users experience climate services, and a lot of issues around the landscape in climate services. One of the really nice outputs of this process were these cartoons. So we had 3 cartoon artists who participated in the dialogues and drew these cartoons to represent different issues that came up. So I've pulled out this one on the right, which really, for me, illustrates some of what the users experience in this climate services landscape. This kind of, if you like, cocktail bar of different drinks that you could be served, and we all know the potential negative effects of different drinks you may order. It's a really nice illustration, and it's very much came from the user perspective. Anyway, back to the landscape. Sorry, I don't know why my camera's gone all blurry, but so just quickly on the landscape, we sit in South Africa and a number of African countries in this interesting intersection of kind of international climate services and local services. So we have international data services that we can tap into, and others tap into. Copernicus Climate Change Services, a really key one, a lot in the US as well. And then we also have international commercial services. So there's a number of international players who are willing and offering commercial climate services, whether they're consultants or data services or so on. And they provide different climate services, not prototypes, that label's a bit wrong. And then on the right there, we have a fair number of international applied research services. So projects that we've been involved on for example, a recent really successful one of Future Climate for Africa. So these are international research programs, but they're very applied, and they have a really strong service kind of element. And many of them will develop these climate services prototypes. So these are really key on the landscape, and they'll come along in waves, if you like, as new opportunities emerge. On the bottom left, really key, and of course, is the National Met Services, who often have a really strong national mandate to provide some level of climate services. A key issue there that always comes up, and I'd be interested to hear perspectives from other countries, is the National Met Services hold or manage the local data. And that's often behind this wall that makes it inaccessible unless you're willing to pay certain fees. And there's a reason for that. That's the financial model of many of the Met Services. And that's a key constraint and a key issue that came up a lot in our dialogues. Then there's local service providers, often consultants focused on particular industries and sectors who will provide climate services, sometimes in partnership with, on the bottom right there, local universities and other science organizations, such as the CSIR, who are really strong in local research, often actually really strong in multidisciplinary expertise. We've spoken about co-production, transdisciplinary kind of research. So often the local universities are quite strong players in that space. And in the middle, we have the sort of user space. We have the private sector users, if you like, so companies. We've worked a lot with insurance companies, big commercial agricultural groupings, and then the government users, if you like, so different sectors of government. I've purposely left off one group here, and that was intentional. They're often hidden. And these are the more informal, small-scale users. So we have a lot of small-scale agriculture in South Africa and many African countries. And we have many other potential users who are often not on these landscape maps because they're kind of invisible. They don't receive many climate services. They don't have the potential to access these climate services, whether it's because of financial reasons, technological reasons, many other reasons. And yet often they are the most vulnerable and the most needy of being able to make informed decisions. But they're often invisible. And certainly in our dialogues, they were invisible, even though we brought them into the discussion. I think that's a really key issue, and it brings up a lot of ethical concerns around access to climate services. So just next slide. So basically, this creates a lot of interesting questions and challenges within the landscape. Just next slide. Thanks. So there are questions of cost. So a lot of the commercial climate services come at a particular cost. What does that mean for equitable access to climate services in countries where there's huge economic disparity and vulnerability disparity that to some extent maps that economic disparity? So cost is a really key issue. Then a question of authority. Do international climate services or international research agencies, organizations, do they have greater scientific authority or credibility than local? That's a perception that often emerges and is really challenging. Where is the latest science? So there's often a demand from users for the latest and greatest, if you like, science. Where does that come from? Does that come from local players, local researchers, local service providers, or does that come from international service providers? Who has the mandate? So often, as I mentioned before, the National Met Service has some kind of mandate, but often don't have the capacity to deliver that mandate. So how do we manage that mandate? In South Africa, it's illegal for anyone except the National Met Service to issue extreme weather warnings. But that in itself is ambiguous and contentious. Do we want more of that? Do we want less of that? These are big challenges. And then Roger actually brought up this question of trust. And this is a really key one. I think a lot of people who are trying to use climate services, fundamentally, they're trying to figure out who to trust in this complex landscape. And again, do they trust big international organizations with a lot of authority and perhaps the latest science? Do they trust local partners who they might know better, who know the environment better? How do they evaluate these different offerings? It's a really confusing landscape. Next slide, please. I just wanted to throw this in here as a discussion point, and I think Roger picked up on it a bit. The whole landscape is often framed as we have an information deficit problem, and certainly when we're approached by stakeholders wanting information, the perception is the information doesn't exist. We need the information. Can you provide us with this information, projections or vulnerability maps or so on? I think sometimes that information deficit does exist, but I'm not always sure. I think sometimes when you dig a little bit, the information does exist in some form or other. The challenge is how that information is used. And I think there's this perception that there's information deficit. And I wonder sometimes where that perception has come from. Do we create and perpetuate that narrative in the way we present and produce these climate services? Are we sure that we're doing the right thing? Are we sure that we're meeting the needs that are actually needed? So I'm throwing that in as a bit of hopefully a discussion point, but I think we need to ask some important questions here. Okay, next slide. Thanks. So another cartoon on the left there, which is perhaps slightly cynical, but often money is a strong motivation. And I'm not saying that in a very negative way. I think fundamentally, whether you're a research organization like ourselves, whether you're a commercial company, fundamentally, you do need finances in order to support what you're doing. So money is an important driver of this landscape. I'm also aware, though, that a lot of people are really just trying to do good. They're trying to do the best they can. They're trying to support good development, good decision making. So I'm not being too cynical here, but money and where the money comes from is a really important thing that we need to talk about, and particularly in these international intersections. And then on the right there, a little cartoon around responsibility. And we spoke a lot in our dialogues about responsibility and who should take responsibility. And this cartoon captures it brilliantly. Should the climate services providers take responsibility for their products, and particularly when the product makes a mistake or is wrong or misinforms, or is that down to the consumers, those who use it? And really, no one wants to take responsibility most of the time. So where did we get to? Just wrapping up, we're at the time here. I don't think we can, at this point, avoid a competitive marketplace in our kind of context. It's been interesting to listen to some of the other cases, but I don't think we can really avoid it. And the alternatives are very likely worse. So having legislation, nationally approved mandated providers, perhaps that'll work in some contexts. And the Australian example is really interesting. I'd like to dig into that further. But in the African context, I think it's very difficult to mandate nationally approved providers. Often there isn't capacity for those particular providers, and it's very unclear who those providers should be. One-stop shops have been promoted quite a bit. I've heard it just the other day, another one-stop shop being set up. And the question is, who gets to set up that shop? Under what authority? Under what mandate? And how many one-stop shops do we end up with? There are quite a number of one-stop shops, which begs a few questions. And then can we define and mandate best practice even? And certainly within the climate science community, this question of what is best practice around climate services, climate projections, seasonal forecasting, whatever, it's not a cut and dry case what the best practice is. So that's equally challenging. But then having this competitive and open market is very vulnerable to perverse, maybe that's too strong a word, but certainly perverse, in some senses, incentives. I just pulled this quote out and I've changed it slightly so I don't get sued, but this came up in an interaction earlier this week. A very prominent, very powerful international climate services provider that's emerging on the landscape made the statement that we provide an AI approach to forecast the maximum daily precipitation in each week up to 6 months ahead. And I looked at their draft paper describing the process, and it's really, really questionable. And yet this is the open market that users are having to engage with. So next slide, final slide. So where we got to in our dialogues, and this is where there's really nice overlap with where all the other presentations have got to, is really the need for this National Climate Services dialogue platform. The only way we could really see of moving forward in this landscape at the moment is to have open, transparent dialogue and debate and deliberation over all these different issues. So we have to have a space where we can debate and dialogue around methods and approaches. We have to support decision makers, and this one is really key in building capacity, but also to help them scope requests for services and interrogate those offerings. So if there's a space where different stakeholders can come and say, this is what someone's offering, what are the different perspectives on this? And then particularly key for this international perspective is facilitate and coordinate the international participation in the landscape. It's really challenging as local stakeholders and local service providers, if you like, when the really prominent international engagements arrive, and we have to figure out how to manage that dynamic. And I think it would be really helpful if this could all kind of be coordinated through this national services dialogue platform. So yeah, that's where we got to in our dialogues. I think there's a lot of crossover. I think there's also some interesting, unique challenges in an African context that I hope we can talk about. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, this was excellent. That was 4, as we said, different perspectives, but there's some common threads through there. And we also heard obviously from Nicola and Louise earlier. So thank you all. I'm not sure if everyone was aware, the session we're aiming to go to 1:15, so we have another 10 or so minutes, but people are having to leave, so that's understandable. Louise has just put up a Menti poll, so in the interest of speed and time, if you have a look at the slide on the screen, and please do the poll. And we have 9 questions, which is excellent, perhaps more than we were expecting. So we will run through as many of these as we can. And if some of the speakers are able to answer any unanswered questions afterwards, that would be great. But if not, we'll think of a way of dealing with the other questions. So that's the plan. So we'll start at the top. So Chris Parker has raced up and suddenly had 10 thumbs up. This came from nowhere. So Chris Parker's question is, from his experience, there is too much top-down focus on climate information and data. Instead, the focus needs to shift to a bottom-up assessment, starting with an understanding of present day and historic vulnerability. This can then inform the appropriate information requirements. How would you tackle this problem? Which of our speakers, 6 speakers, would like to address this? Keith, your hand went straight up.
Yeah, I quite like this question because this is one we often come across ourselves. And the way we kind of like to think of it is that, I mean, a climate service in essence is you have all your climate data, so huge amounts of climate data, but then you have your sector experts as well who are answering a very specific question, and it's blending the two of them together is what gives you your climate service. So the way I like to think it is that typically when you develop a climate service, the standard way of doing it is you will get your past data. You will look to see how past data affected your particular vulnerability, so your knowledge of the past, and then you'll use the projections to see, well, how will that affect the future? I mean, that's your standard template for developing a climate service. Where it starts to get a little more difficult then is, well, what past climate data do you use? Do you use a time series from a weather station, for example? Do you use premium reanalysis data sets? Some people like to use historic runs from a climate model because then you've got less biases when you start to look into the future. So all of a sudden it starts to get quite complicated quite quickly. So the way I like to think of it is that it's kind of, from a climate data point of view, some of the climate data experts almost provide a top-down guidance or standardization suggestions, but it's the sector experts who know what those vulnerabilities are like at ground level, provide that bottom-up approach. And it's where that top-down approach and bottom-up approach meet is where you see some of the best climate services being developed.
Thank you, Keith. And Christopher?
Yeah, thanks. I think I can build on that. I completely agree with the question. But I think one of the key challenges is we've set up the climate services very much from a science-driven perspective. So the whole view, if you like, of a climate services is that it's providing climate information. Whereas I think we need to reframe climate services. And again, this probably aligns more with what Roger was saying. We need to reframe climate services as facilitating a process with stakeholders, and that should be the driving mechanism. And at some point within that process, you may need climate information, or you may not actually. There are definitely cases where you actually don't need much climate information to make those kind of decisions. The problem is selling that as a service is a lot harder than just saying we've got some very nice visualizations and some very flashy maps that we can provide you. Thanks.
We're going to run out of time. I was going to go to Nicola, and Roger's put his hand up as well. Nicola, if you can be brief, sorry, and Roger, if you can be even briefer, thank you.
I was just going to very briefly comment, absolutely agree with the question. I think one thing that came up through our workshops was that even if you are focused on the historical present day risk, not everyone has access to or is using the right data, and people are using very out of date historical baselines to look at present risk. So absolutely focusing on how we can get people access to the data that they need to be using to understand present risk before we focus on future risk.
Nicely put, thank you. Roger?
No, just very quickly, Chris. Chris's question really gets back to, are we really addressing the user's needs? Is it user focused, decision focused? Because most users are also trying to, their starting point is also dealing with the existing adaptation and resilience deficit. Selling climate services is only focusing on, the future is not dealing with the user's needs. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. So Murray Dale's question was next, but it's been moved to the answered section. I'm not sure his question has been answered. I'm not sure how to deal with this now. So Murray, do you think your question has been answered? If not, would you like to ask it? Perhaps Murray's gone. Maybe that's why it was moved. Okay, so we'll move to the next question. Jason Lowe, how can we better equip?
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Apologies. Yeah, it was really a brilliant presentations. I loved this session, but the just if there are any tips from the colleagues who spoke from Australia and Ireland about what they've done there in their own national frameworks, and whether they the top one or two imports.
Perfect. So maybe Karl, give Karl a chat if Karl is still with us.
Yeah, I'm still here. No, I'm still awake. Yeah, look, I think there's a number of ways we can approach that. I was just trying to think off the top of my head some of the things that have been really important. So as we've seen from all these talks, there's actually a lot of thinking here. It's how we actually turn that into something that delivers a concrete framework. So really carefully building the partnerships and making sure, we looked at those relationships. We had the right motivations in the decision makers who would be instrumental in both releasing the budget for this type of a frame service, and also building the institutional arrangements to do that, so the governance arrangements. And that there's no shortcut to doing that. So it's actually just a lot of hard work, and it's a lot of persistence, and it's a lot of not being disheartened. So I guess that's my my top one.
Thank you, Karl. Roger, your hand is up. Is that an old hand, or is that Roger Street?
It's a legacy.
Okay, great. Thank you. Keith?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so from an Ireland's perspective, I mean, we're very much in the beginning of this journey, and so it was still in the developmental stage of it. But one of the scenarios we're considering is building the framework in a scalable way. So ideally, the premium frameworks would be all services across the full climate spectrum. But if you start off as your starting spot, it can be quite difficult to get that off the ground. Whereas one of the scenarios we're looking at is maybe we just focus on the adaptation part, because we already have evidence and documentation from our climate change advisory councils and elsewhere that we could do with better coordination and better standardization in the adaptation space. So if we can build a framework around the adaptation part of it, then show that there's value to that, it may be easier then to scale up staff and funding and everything else to slowly progress down the rest of the climate spectrum into the mitigation space, into the shorter term forecast space, seasonal forecasting and so forth as well. So something that maybe we're considering is potentially starting with a scalable model that can grow as it's proved itself, if you like.
And
Great.
I'd just like to second that. I wish I'd said it actually. So yeah, really starting with something that isn't, so don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and actually build the foundations that need to be built before you actually try and scale it up. But leave in that process the ability to keep engaging the people that you haven't engaged at the start to build a proper full service.
Excellent, thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. So the top on my list is Jason Lowe. How can we better equip both providers and users to be able to engage in appropriate COEX? Roger, this may be one for you to start. You're muted, Roger.
Yes,
there we
go.
I
just realized that. How can we do that? And it gets back to a question that was also asked earlier. Is there are good examples of COEX? And I think that what the problem is that a lot of that is hidden, or it isn't put out in a way that it can be debated and well understood what is appropriate COEX and how we could better implement COEX. And I think that's something that needs to be done. I know Jason, we had that conversation a little bit earlier. And I still strongly believe that needs to be done, and there needs to be more purposeful sharing of that information, rather than just, it's sort of, we did it through co-design or co-development or whatever it's called in research papers, and then there's no explanation, no opportunity to discuss what's involved. So I think that's really important, is to understand what is being used, what is seen, and why is it seen as being appropriate for particular activities, and then we could better understand how we go from there.
Agreed, thank you. Nicola?
Yeah, absolutely agree with what Roger said. And I also feel like a major step forward would be to look at how projects and how this kind of work is funded, and the kind of models that we use for undertaking this, because we find barriers in enabling people to work closely with users, enabling users to participate fully in the process. And it just doesn't seem to work quite well at the minute. I think the examples where we've seen embedded researchers taking part, either in the UK, there's some good examples from South Africa, I know Chris could talk about, that really show that having that formal setup of close engagement from the start really does help.
Thank you. And the final word from Christopher.
Thanks. I just wanted to, I wanted to support that and to what Nicola was saying. But I think there's two questions: is how can we better equip, but definitely that enabling environment is really, really important. And what are the incentive structures that are driving certain approaches? So I think the funding environment, and again, particularly speaking from the international kind of development space, the funding structures, the funding mechanisms behind a lot of the climate services development are to some extent dictating certain forms of engagement. And I think we need to take a look at that kind of funding environment and the enabling environment as much as looking at how we build capacity.
Excellent, thank you. I'm out of time for my section, so I will thank you all, but I'm going to pass over now to Jason Lowe, who I hope is still on the line, who's going to say some closing remarks. Jason, are you there? You had some technical difficulties.
Thanks, Chris. I'm back, certainly with audio. Not
Excellent.
sure with video, but that isn't needed for this. We've got 2 webinars planned at the moment on the radar. One of those is next week. So next week we'll be having James Cooper talk in particular around erosion hazards and economic damage to critical infrastructure in river catchments. Do please join us for that one at noon on the 21st. Then we have a summer break. We're already filling up our autumn schedule with new talks and new events. The first of those will be Rachel Perks on the 29th of September, and she'll be talking about Coastal Defender and how we provide climate information in a useful way to inform flood defences. Thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.